Hi, this is just the concluding part of chapter 6. I had a technical issue. This is Angela Power Disney reading into the record, a book which is difficult to find. And if it is available on Amazon, it's over $200 at the moment. The whereabouts of the author are unknown, although he is believed to be still alive. His name is Tim Tate. And this book was published in 1991 as an authoritative, one of 3 authoritative scholarly books on record about satanic ritual abuse and crime. Very much needed reading for police forces, social workers and therapists and parents of victims. And for anybody that hasn't guessed, I'm a survivor, so I'm sorry if some of my reading bears testament to the fact that I'm triggered. So I'll try and conclude this now. Chapter 6, Part B. Okay, so we're talking about this rather ill-equipped social worker who would turn up at the door unannounced, knock on the door and ask Ileana if she had been sexually harassing any children. The trial transcript continues. Did you speak to any of the children? No. Did you speak to any of the parents? No. Did you get any names of children or parents? No. Did you try and track down the source of the complaint? No. Did you ever do anything other than ask the woman who answered the door whether she was sexually harassing children? No. The caseworker then returned to her office and listed the complaints as unfounded. Only a determined and vocal campaign by parents of the children involved forced a trial in which Ileana later turned state evidence, and Frank Fuster received 6 consecutive life sentences. Law enforcement lessons do not end with the inadequacies of an individual caseworker. Children at the Country Walk Centre had repeatedly and independently told investigators that they had been made to drink a liquid they called demon slime, that the abuse had taken the form of games, the caca, excrement game, and the pee-pee, urine game, being the most common, that Frank Fuster killed animals, including some bluebirds, in front of them, and that the proceedings had been videotaped. Rather than trying to place these seemingly bizarre allegations in some form of context, the prosecutors simply left them hanging in the evidence with no attempt of explanation. To the Fusters' defense lawyers, this was meat and drink. Both attorneys, the couple were separately represented, argued that it proved the children were fantasizing the entire abuse story. Ileana's counsel went further, accusing the children's therapist of a, quote, more subtle form of coercion than the North Vietnamese did to our prisoners of war. It was to be an allegation commonly heard in the years between 1985 and 1990. Had it not been for Ileana's sudden decision to plead guilty and testify against her husband, the Country Walk prosecution would almost certainly have collapsed, the victim of inadequate law enforcement research and intelligence. One final lesson should have emerged from the case. The child victims at Country Walk had alleged that their ritual abuse was videotaped. None were found, yet Ileana Fuster confirmed the stories. In case after subsequent case, children would be disbelieved about allegations of ritual abuse because they refused to retract claims that the ceremonies had been videotaped when none were found. Had US law enforcement taken the trouble to study the transcripts of Ileana Fuster's evidence, they would have found a possible explanation for the missing tapes. Quite simply, that a fellow cult member removed them. 6 of the remaining 8 successful American prosecutions revealed ritual abuse taking place in daycare centers. Although the prosecutions made little or no reference to the ritual aspect, In only 2 cases was there no daycare involvement, but in each case, the prosecuting attorney took a decision to allow evidence of rituals to go before the jury. The first of these was in Santa Rosa, California, and resulted in substantial prison terms for Darrell Ball and Charlotte Thrailkill after lengthy plea bargaining on multiple molestation charges. The second concerned a former chief civil deputy in the sheriff's office, Thurston County, Washington State, called Paul Ingram. His case was, in the event, easier than most, at least insofar as it concerned him personally. Ingram pleaded guilty to ritually abusing an indefinite number of children over a 17-year period. But his allegations that he was not alone, that a second deputy and a state patrol employee were also involved, were dismissed and never followed up. The details of the Santa Rosa and Thurston County allegations need not, in the event, concern us. They matched claim for ritual claim those made by children across America and throughout Europe and Australia. Indeed, we need to examine why other prosecutions either failed or were never brought, and to do that, we must investigate the investigators themselves. Thank you. The US law enforcement community. Quote, this issue has divided investigators like no other before it. It has become the situation that if you work this field, you have to take one side or the other, for or against. And if you don't agree with what one side is thinking, then to them, you're one of the bad guys. You've gone over to the other side. To me, that's sick thinking, and I just don't want any part of it anymore. This was the view of the detective with probably the most experience, the most rigorous mind, and most balanced approach on the thorny problem of ritual abuse, expressed in January 1991. Sandra Daly Badioni, intelligence officer, graduate in criminology and cult crime specialist, left ritual abuse casework in the middle of 1989, exhausted both by the nature of the cases and by the polarization of opinion within the law enforcement community. Sandra Bargioni is better known by her name before marriage, Sandy Gallant. For nearly a decade, she was the doyenne of cult investigations, and room 558 in San Francisco Police Department's Criminal Intelligence Building at 850 Bryant, the mecca of all those with a bizarre case to solve. A small and patient woman, she joined SFPD in 1964 as a civilian fingerprint technician. Relatively quickly, she signed up as a uniformed cop before graduating to plainclothes detective work. She was assigned to the intelligence division in the late 1970s with a brief to detect emerging trends in criminal behavior and predict the direction of forthcoming organized crime activity. Inevitably, Southern California has fully earned its reputation for attracting more than its fair share of, quote, crazies. This brought her into contact with the myriad networks of quasi-religious cults that littered the coast after the collapse of the Flower Power era. One of these was Satanism. Gallant's research into satanic cults, careful, methodical, and painstaking, soon earned her the epithet of Satan's cop from her colleagues and the enmity of a defensive occult world. As it turned out, neither was justified. Satanism formed only a small part of her brief, albeit one that guaranteed headlines, and she was equally interested in drugs, terrorism, and a raft of other potentially criminal cults from Caribbean voodoo to Latin America Santeria. I did not ever do ritualistic crimes day in and day out. I actively worked on only a few selected cases as an officer investigating with a view to prosecution. Obviously, since I'm in the intelligence division, my job is to keep information and files on a variety of groups. I cover everything from organized crime to drugs. But the view that's been put out about of Sandy Gallant single-handedly taking on the occult and persuading San Francisco Police Department to set up America's only ritualistic crime detail is pure baloney. If such a detail ever existed, I was it, and I didn't work the field full time even before I gave it up. Polarization within the US law enforcement is a self-inflicted wound which has effectively paralyzed any unified attempt at understanding or controlling the groups which practice ritual abuse. According to Gallant, quote, if the FBI could just spend a year researching the problem, investigating, finding out what's really going on, then I think we could get a whole lot further. This, in some ways, is like the situation we found when we first confronted child pornography. If we look, we find it. The problem for America now is that we have a series of local cops doing ritual abuse casework, sometimes on very shaky grounds, and no one is putting together the information gleaned into an overview. The FBI, of course, has carried out some research. Its behavioral science unit has hosted and provided speakers for the growing number of conferences and seminars covering the issue of ritual crime. In particular, Ken Lanning has made genuine efforts to study and draw lessons from the patchwork of information spread throughout the United States. That research alone places him within the moderate group of American detectives with a view on the subject. At the close of the 1980s, there were three rival factions within the US law enforcement community. There were those like Robert Hicks, whose views were nakedly skeptical. Opposing him were openly Christian detectives, whose faith rather than forensic skills led them to near unquestioning acceptance. And between them were isolated and moderate professional investigators who weighed up evidence and assessed each case that came before them on its individual merits. With a weary inevitability, they were sniped at from both extreme wings. We need first to examine what became known as Christ's cops, since much of the opposing debate amounted to an attack on their religious affiliations rather than on the concept of ritual crime itself. The most influential of these religiously motivated investigators is Larry Jones from the relatively insignificant Boise, Idaho Police Department. Jones, who makes no secret of his Christianity, is the moving force behind an organization called Cult Crime Network, Inc., and publisher of its restricted journal, File 18 newsletter. File 18 was first published in 1985 and is mailed quarterly to at least 1,500 subscribers. Most are involved, officially or not, in investigating ritual crime. Jones advises his readers that they should investigate mockery of the Christian sacraments and claims that there is a major international conspiracy of, quote, upper-level Satanists who plan to take over the world. Quote, I don't mean to sound paranoid, he told Newsweek magazine in December 1988, but the walls have ears for us now. It's very prophetic. The problem with Jones is precisely that he is paranoid. An instability born out of religious zeal, fostered by the evident decline in support for Orthodox Christianity, and fed by bogus scare stories. Of these, the so-called Wicca letters are the most famous and most pervasive, turning up endlessly in Christian publications with a distinctly fundamentalist bias. Purporting to be a world domination master plan drawn up by a, brackets, non-existent occult organization called Witches International Coven Council, Wicca, the document is a piece of classic black propaganda in the tradition of the anti-Semitic Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Like that rabid and deranged text, the Wicca letters bear no resemblance to reality or empirical truth. Despite this, their contents have been widely, gratefully, and uncritically presented to the readers of File 18. The document lists 7 goals of the alleged Wicca world domination conspiracy. 1. To bring the covens, both black and white magic, into one and have the actress, or have the arctress, a sort of international high priestess, to govern all, accomplished. 2, to bring about personal debts, causing discord and disharmony within families. Accomplished. 3, to remove or educate the, quote, New Age youth by A, infiltrating boys, girls clubs and big sister brother programs. B, infiltrating schools, having prayers removed, having teachers teach about drugs, sex, freedoms. C, instigating and promoting rebellion against parents and all authority. D, promoting equal rights for youth. Accomplished. 4, to gain access to all people's backgrounds and vital information by A, use of computers, B, convenience, C, infiltration. Accomplished. 5, to have laws changed to benefit our ways, such as A, removing children from the home environment and placing them in our foster homes. B, mandatory placement of children in our daycare centres. C, increased taxes. D, open drug and pornography market. Marked in 1991, not yet accomplished. 6, to destroy government agencies by A, overspending, B, public opinion, C, being on the offensive always, opposing, demonstrating, demoralizing. 1991, marked not yet accomplished. 7, not to be revealed until all else has been accomplished. The target date at that time, the time of that Wicca Covenant Code alleged, the target date for revelation was June 21st, 1986, the beginning of the summer solstice, and a great feast on the Satanic calendar. If this rambling seems too absurd for belief, Larry Jones and his cult crime network followers have been eager to accept it. Jones has mailed out copies to a company File 18 newsletter. The grand Satanic conspiracy theory forms the basis of CCN's worldview. Despite the absence of genuine facts to support it, Jones explains away that problem by turning the argument on its head. Quote, those who deny, explain away, or cover up the obvious undeniable growing mountain of evidence often demand statistical evidence or positive linkages between operational suspect groups. At best, this demand for positive proof of a horizontal conspiracy is naive. Consider the possibility that the reason supposedly unrelated groups in different localities over various time periods acting out in a similar manner is that consistent directives are received independently from higher levels of authority. Instead of being directly linked to each other, these groups may be linked vertically to a common source of direction and control. This vertical conspiracy model is consistent with the authoritarian structure seen in many cult and occult groups. Those who accept this theory as a reasonable possibility need to rethink the meaning, sense, and effect of the term conspiracy. The author continues, the chief problem with this explanation for the remarkable similarity of testimony from child survivors is that it is based on a fictional conspiracy. The most likely reason for the repetition across the world of the key indicators of ritual abuse is that satanic worship exists to its own folk memory pattern. That is, that a large number of individual groups follow the historic practices of devil worship without any supervisory control of a word council of super Satanists. And here we have an editorial note from Craig McGowan. It's my opinion Tate's complete shit bucket assessment here is maybe an ounce of water short. I write that with a heavy heart. Still, I will offer that Jones's thesis of a world council of Satanists may have some merit. Tate previously presented witness testimony of convention or symposium of high priests in prior text. He acknowledges such scheduled camps as a means of training, yet seemingly here discounts intent of dictating an agenda. Possibly, where I square high-level Satanist, Jones prefers super Satanists. Furthermore, I cannot completely discount that an agenda has been dictated from a presiding Grand Master Shingon or decreed high priest. As to Wicca and Jones's doctrine, I haven't found proof of the existence of the aforementioned Witches International Coven Council. Nevertheless, there are other groups, such as the American Council of Witches, founded in 1973, and which convened in April 1974 to draft a set of common principles of Wicca and witchcraft in America. To reconcile his otherwise stellar presentation, I feel possibly Tate's complete dismissal may be due to his adapted bias and prejudice, yes, against evangelical Christianity, in my humble opinion. For I concur, Craig. Right, back to the text by Tim Tate. Yes, he does seem to have I agree. Sadly, CNN's influence has been extensive and has led to ever more extreme interpretations by groups without Jones's few sensibilities. The Idaho officer has at least conceded that witchcraft and Satanism are different and distinct religions. Of these, the worst is undoubtedly founded and run by Lyndon H. LaRouche. LaRouche, a rabid anti-communist, occasional Democratic presidential candidate, and in 1989, occupant of a federal jail cell for earlier dishonesty, publishes a number of self-promoting magazines from America and Germany. These rejoice variously in the titles Executive Intelligence Review, Investigative Leads, and The New Federalist. Some of their journalism is soundly based. Investigative Leads, for example, has been at the forefront of penetrating the defense geometrical psychobabble of OTO lodges to reveal individual criminal behavior which it obscures. But the LaRouche-inspired analysis is paranoid gibberish, determinedly promoting the grand international occult conspiracy theory. Quote, there was an extraordinary mobilization in the first months of 1988 by Gnostic sects and cults openly seeking to subvert both the political social process and the military and intelligence services of Western nations. These groups literally believe themselves to be the Antichrist. Among coordinating agencies behind this mobilization are the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, Wicca, the Gnostic Church, the psychoanalytical networks associated with the late Gnostic psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung, important elements of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and factions of the Socialist International. The leading circles of these groups are well connected to the intelligence services of the Eastern Bloc. It's hardly surprising that such arrant nonsense, in the opinion of the author, attracts widespread hostility among American police forces. But it is precisely because US law enforcement has almost entirely failed to tackle the problem of ritual abuse that groups of frustrated parents whose children were victims have turned to the less reliable freelance cult investigators who blend genuine case evidence with a prejudice against anything from witchcraft to fantasy role-playing games such as Dungeons and Dragons. This, in turn, has created an ever deeper antagonism and skepticism from already suspicious detectives, a vicious circle with children as the ultimate losers. The man who best exemplifies the skeptics is Robert Hicks, a criminal analyst rather than a hands-on investigator. Like his opposite number in the CCN, Hicks begins his analysis from a sound and rational base. Quote, child abuse does exist. Some people commit violent crimes while invoking the power of Satan. Such people may act with others, but law enforcers cannot demonstrate the existence of a widespread satanic conspiracy. The evidence doesn't exist. No evidence links fantasy role-playing games to teen suicides. Officers can and should stick to the constitutional basics. They investigate irregular behavior based on a well-founded and legally defined reasonable suspicion. They arrest based on probable cause. No one expects police to ignore pentagrams drawn in blood at a homicide scene. Complete documentation of crime scenes has always been the rule. But we have no justification for carrying on unwarranted explorations of the beliefs of an unpopular few, or for waving books of satanic liturgy at seminars and pronouncing them dangerous. It is this last sentence which betrays Hicks. His brackets understandable hostility to the paranoid fantasies of LaRouche and Larry Jones has led him to an equally shrill opinion. His own lectures at what might best be described as anti-satanic crime seminars clearly illustrate an analyst who has allowed skepticism and prejudice to get the better of the facts. Despite this large-scale conspiracy alleged by Jones, etc., police have still uncovered no evidence of cult's murderous activities. No evidence supports the idea that daycare workers subject children to abuse in propitiation of Satan. No evidence exists supporting the literal truth of cult survivors' claims. Leaving aside the successfully prosecuted cases, leaving aside even the multiplicity of evidence surrounding the process church of the final judgment, ignoring even the clear incitements to murder in Crowley's rituals, Hicks' analysis is deeply flawed because it is entirely negative. He advances no explanation other than the suggestion that leading questions had been put by conspiracy-minded therapists for the identical disclosures of child victims across the globe. By allowing his anti-Christian bias to dominate, Hicks encourages the view that satanic ritual abuse does not exist. In fact, it does no such thing, and Hicks' allegation is an untenable act as his opponent's conspiracy is as untenable as his opponent's conspiracy theories. Repeatedly throughout 1989, he drew audiences to lectures on this negative approach, specifically warning investigators not to undertake intelligence gathering on satanic groups because there was no evidence to link them to criminal activity. Sounds to me like he was on the payroll. Quote, while cult seminar presenters caution about respecting First Amendment rights of citizens practicing unusual beliefs, the same officers can't help but inflict their bias on audiences. Anything that's not mainstream Christianity is dubbed a non-traditional belief. Cult officers distribute handouts at seminars showing symbols to identify at crime scenes, accompanied by their meanings, as if Satanists worldwide universally use the symbols in precise configurations with identical meanings. Law enforcers do have tools adequate to do their jobs. The FBI's serial crime psychological profiling model incorporates, without the satanic bias, the proper questions to ask to correlate a possible criminal ideology to ritualized, that is committed similarly on multiple occasions, violent crimes. In short, law enforcers must remove the cult from cult crime and do their jobs accordingly. Wow. What in effect this suggests is that what matters in detecting crime is what has happened, not the motive for it. Whilst this may be applicable to routine reactive police work, it is grotesquely inapplicable to the business of crime prevention. Intelligence departments exist to study criminal patterns and motivation in the hope that this may help preempt the development of a crime swing. By excluding Satanism, Hicks was advocating the partial blindment of US law enforcement. Inevitably, this type of distorted analysis took its toll on the third group inside American investigators, the non-aligned professional faction. The effect can most markedly be seen in the work of Ken Lanning of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. When in February 1985, he opened America's first ever conference on daycare center and satanic cult sexual exploitation of children at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, his speech was neutral and his tone measured, or tone. Quote, when unusually bizarre events are reported by a child, more than child sexual abuse may be involved. However, investigators have not yet been able to determine whether or not children are really being murdered and sacrificed, or even whether, quote, snuff films do exist. The lack of first-hand confirmation of bizarre child sexual abuse has made investigating reports of such activity difficult. The offenders themselves are part of the bizarre nature of the cases. In some instances, investigators have found that the perpetrators are not traditional paedophiles. Instead, they are involved in child sexual abuse in ways unfamiliar to investigators, such as cult ritual activity. When dealing with this unknown, law enforcement often finds it difficult to formulate an investigative strategy that will prove successful. The many unanswered questions about daycare center and satanic cult sexual exploitation of children illustrate the complexity of the issue in this new area of investigation. Conferences and consultation allow investigators not only to share what they have learned, but also to contribute to a broader understanding of the problem. This first conference establishes a common bond amongst its participants, allowing them to realize they are not isolated in fighting yet another area of child sexual abuse. Now compare that to a paper Lanning produced in August 1989. Quote, bizarre crime and evil can occur without organized satanic activity. The fact is that far more crime and physical child abuse has been committed by zealots in the name of God, Jesus, and Muhammad than has ever been committed in the name of Satan. Many people don't like that statement, but few can argue with it. Blaming Satanism for a teenager's vandalism, theft, suicide, or even an act of murder is like blaming a criminal's offences on his tattoos. Both are often signs of the same rebelliousness and lack of self-esteem that contribute to the commission of crimes. Within that 5-year period, Lanning had apparently abandoned his open mind policy for that of the skeptic. And yet his analysis, even in its choice of an example, is surprisingly flawed for such an eminent law enforcement authority. Apparently, satanically motivated youth crime may indeed be evidence of adolescence inadequacy or disturbance, as Lanning argues. But as with tattoos, the investigator needs to ask which came first, the crime or the disturbance. The tattoo analogy is apt. Some organized crime operations, notably the Japanese Yakuza, require their members to wear ornate and identifying tattoos. International criminal intelligence departments from Tokyo to New York, San Francisco to London recognize both the typology and significance of these markings. Research has shown such understanding to be vital in the law enforcement effort. The same thought process needs to be extended to any allegedly organized crime group. Satanic child abuse networks amount to organized crime and should not be excluded from scrutiny on the grounds of religious freedom alone. To be fair to Lanning, his cautious analysis is concerned more with redressing the imbalance of information presented at satanic abuse conferences caused by the energetic efforts of Larry Jones and his ilk. To this end, he advocates a sensible, secular approach by investigators of apparently satanic crime. Quote, the law enforcement investigator must objectively evaluate the significance of any criminal's spiritual belief. In most cases, including those involving Satanists, it will have little or no legal significance. If a crime is committed as part of a belief system, it should make no difference which belief system it is. Law enforcement officers who believe that the investigation of satanic occult crime puts them in conflict with supernatural forces of evil should probably not be assigned to these cases. If, however, such officers must be or are assigned, they will need the power of their own spiritual belief system in order to deal with the superstition and religious implications of these cases. The religious beliefs of officers should provide spiritual strength and support for them, but not affect the objectivity and professionalism of the investigation. There must be a middle ground in this issue. Concern about satanic or cult activity should not be a big joke limited to religious fanatics. On the other hand, law enforcement is not now locked in a life and death struggle against the supernatural forces of ancient evil. Law enforcement officers need to know something about Satanism and the occult in order to properly evaluate their possible connection to and motivations for criminal activity. From a community relations perspective, they must also learn to respect spiritual beliefs that may be unpopular but that are not illegal. The focus must be on the objective investigation of violations of criminal statutes. Admirably, even-handed though Lanning's conclusions are, such has been the heat generated by internal law enforcement feuding that such rational approaches are frequently ignored. The case of the McMartin preschool, which we shall examine in Chapter 7, shows how the polarized debate has paralyzed effective investigation. Inside the law enforcement community, it claimed its biggest victim when in March 1989, Sandy Gallant ceased gathering intelligence on satanic cults. Although she occasionally agrees to act as a consultant on ritual abuse investigations, her former work in researching and analyzing trends stopped when she left the field. And yet her intelligence has been among the most important in understanding the changing nature of devil worship and its relationship to ritual crime. Quote, I think if you look at the historical aspect of Satanism, then you can clearly see that ritual child abuse is almost a prerequisite for the ceremonies. These days, the groups I used to monitor work differently. They claim to be the purists, the Puritans almost, of their religion, and it is very much more intellectual pursuit. But you will always get one or two who take their group in a particularly perverse direction, possibly as a result of the historical context. That is not a universal feature of modern satanic practice, but it does exist, and ritual abuse does happen. Law enforcement needs to be aware of that and of the nature of any cult, Satanism or not. That Gallant has been a casualty of the Satan wars within her own profession is a disgrace. But what of the real victims of satanic abuse? How has the system served them? And then a note there, footnote, is a summary of the recommendations for investigators of satanic ritual crime drawn up by Gallant and her fellow professionals, appears in Appendix 2. Just going to pause for a second here before starting therapy for ritually abused children. Therapy for ritually abused children. No other type of abuse is as long-lasting, as damaging, and as demanding of therapists as satanic ritual abuse. Not only is the actual clinical work with the victims far more complicated than, quote, ordinary molestation cases, not only will there frequently be immense problems with the child's family, but on top of everything, society doesn't want to know and will round on those who try and tell it. Pam Hudson has a clear-sighted view of the problems of counselling ritual abuse victims, both adults and children. She has seen scores of patients in the years since she began to confront the reality of such crimes. In 1984, nor is she alone. Wherever social workers have encountered ritual abuse survivors, they have needed to use a markedly different type and intensity of therapy than would have been needed in molestation cases without any ritual aspect. According to Judith Dawson, Nottingham's child abuse consultant, quote, "There is an immense barrier of fear. These children appear to have been terrorized by what they have seen or been made to take part in. Just getting beyond that can present a real challenge to the social worker, and it can take a long time. And after the child feels safe enough to disclose, the process may go on for years rather than weeks or months. In my experience, social services departments and police forces are not really able to cope well with this lengthy process because it costs a lot of time and money, and because it can confuse or disrupt any prosecution based on the children's evidence. The disclosures typically come in recognizable stages. At each level, the child victim has to come to terms with articulating a particular aspect of the abuse and with trusting the adult therapist with information that implicates him in, quote, bad behavior. Pam Hudson has developed a clinical model of this pattern of disclosure. Quote, "The first thing that will come is the sexual and physical abuse. Then the children will typically describe having to endure being defecated upon and urinated upon. Next will come the fact that they have been made to eat or ingest this stuff in some way, and they have a very hard time with that part of the disclosure. It will progress from there so that they describe torture and the killing of animals or children. The very last thing that usually comes out is that they have had to eat the flesh of the dead babies. They really have a hard time coming to terms with the ingestion of flesh or blood, be it from animals or humans. That really is the very last thing they will tell you. It takes them a lot of courage and the therapists a lot of time and patience to get to that point. Yet I have heard that from many children in many cases." Hudson's technique may now use this developed model, but that does not mean that she coaxes or leads children into disclosing abuse they have not suffered. She has watched with a weary dismay the collapse of a number of ritual abuse cases after therapists have been discovered employing leading questions or applying under pressure to get results from the youngsters in their care. Nor is this a uniquely North American problem. The structure of most Western legal systems can mean that victims of child sexual abuse, ritual or otherwise, place foster parents and therapists in the role of initial evidence gatherers. Inevitably, such evidence has frequently been contaminated by inexperienced interviewers asking leading questions. We will see how this has developed into the dangerous myth that almost all such interviews are inadmissible when we examine the Nottingham case in the next chapter. But that it happens at all is an indication of the inadequacy of the legal structure to handle abuse cases. In 1990, the Secretary of the English Criminal Bar Association, Anne Rafferty QC, spelt out the problem. Quote, "If you visualize, let's say, a notional 8-year-old in a foster home with a sensible, loving foster mother, and she comes home and complains of what appears to be a sexual abuse with overtones of Satanism or ritualism, she'll say a certain amount, and typically the warmth of the foster parent will mean that instinct says to wrap her in your arms, sit her on your knee, let her spit out whatever she can, and then, when she comes to a halt or becomes distressed, ask, draw out the rest. If when she becomes distressed or grinds to a halt, the questions that come from a loving, worried, competent foster mum are what lawyers would call leading. Did he touch you, sweetheart? Did he take your knickers down? The damage to the potentially successful prosecution has already begun. It doesn't take much to work out that the line of cross-examination will be, well, you hadn't thought of knickers until your foster mum told you. It wasn't something you said first. Thus, when the child has spoken to her foster mum, a social worker will arrive who will also want to assure himself or herself of what's going on. There may well be another chronicle from the little girl, which may mean further questioning, possibly more firmly honed than foster mums, possibly not. But in any event, another account number 2. Then the police will arrive. They may arrive with the social worker, so we will be saved one further interview, but they may not. It's not an ideal world. And the potential for it going on and on increases with every hour. It's nobody's fault, given the system as it now is. I'll just say editorially, that can be dealt with and prevented by doing exactly what was done with the Hampstead children, which is to interview their first disclosures, or very close to their first disclosures, to videotape them. And then that spares the child from having to tell and retell and retell and retell, and the case being collapsed with alleged leading. Anyway, to continue. As we shall see, 2 of the most important cases of alleged satanic ritual abuse in Britain and America, being Nottingham and McMartin, have demonstrated the truth of Rafferty's analysis. Children have been repeatedly questioned with varying degrees of professionalism. Skeptical detectives have seized on apparently unending disclosures as evidence of improper counselling, and defence lawyers have routinely claimed that social workers obsessed by Satanism have somehow indoctrinated children to making false and fanciful statements. To some extent, and particularly in Great Britain, social workers and their supervisors have only themselves to blame. There has been no attempt empirically to access the patterns of disclosure, nor the relative impacts of ritual abuse compared to, quote, ordinary sexual abuse. Only in America has such scientific research been carried out, and then nearly a decade after the first survivors' stories began to emerge publicly. In October 1990, the University of California's Department of Psychology, together with the Research and Education Institute of the Harbor UCLA Medical Center, published the findings of its own scientific trials. The study took 3 matched groups of children as its samples. One was drawn from the victims of an alleged ritual sex abuse ring in a preschool. The second came from a similar preschool case in which the perpetrator's sexual and physical abuse had no ritual or satanic context. And the third was a control group of similarly aged children from the same background who had never experienced any form of sexual or physical abuse. The aim was to compare the effects on the children's emotional and physical development. Quote, there were several differences between the 2 groups reporting sexual abuse. The ritual sex abuse group alleged ritualistic and terrorizing acts in addition to sexual abuse, endured much community controversy and disbelief, and was involved in lengthy, highly publicized legal proceedings that resulted in no convictions. On the other hand, the children in the sexual abuse group reported sexual abuse without ritualistic or terrorizing elements. The perpetrator admitted guilt and he was quickly sentenced to spend the rest of his life in jail. Analysis indicated that anal intercourse and foreign object penetration were reported more significantly in the ritual sex abuse group than in the sexual abuse group. In the ritual sex abuse group, vague statements about sexual abuse and disclosures about less intrusive sexual acts. Ritualistic abuse was disclosed significantly later in the course of treatment than any other type of abusive acts. I'll read that again, I didn't make much sense of that. Analysis indicated that anal intercourse and foreign object penetration were reported more significantly in the ritual sexual abuse than in the sexual abuse group. In the ritual sexual abuse group, vague statements about sexual abuse and disclosures about less intrusive sexual acts. Ritualistic abuse was disclosed significantly later in the course of treatment than any other type of abusive acts. Interestingly, while a sizable portion of children in both the ritual sexual abuse and the sexual abuse groups retracted their allegations at some point in treatment, 27% for the ritual sexual abuse and 23% for sexual abuse, all but one child in each group subsequently redisclosed, and many revealed previously undisclosed acts. Again, refer you to the Hampstead cover-up. Retracting is quite common. Yeah, 27% of the ritual sexual abuse group retracted at one point and then redisclosed. 23% of sexual abuse. The retractions in the sexual abuse group are especially intriguing in that the perpetrator admitted molesting the children and the community was highly supportive. And the footnote is the report uses the term ritualistic in a rather general sense. From its contents, it's clear that what it meant is genuine ritual abuse in the terms of the Finkel or definition. That finding confirmed what sexual abuse therapists worldwide have known for nearly a decade. Victims routinely retract their disclosures, frequently out of fear, embarrassment, or shame, only to reinstate them once the therapeutic or law enforcement response is supportive. But in ritual abuse cases, that support is rarely forthcoming, and the retraction gratefully grasped by skeptical detectives. As we shall see when we consider the Nottingham case in Chapter 7, this pattern was used to justify an increasingly hostile police attitude. The UCLA report drew out a series of important scientific conclusions from the study and made recommendations to the law enforcement, judicial, and therapeutic communities on the best methods of handling cases of ritualistic abuse. Quote, ritualistic sexual abuse of children has major effects on their functioning. As compared with non-abused children, children reporting RSA exhibited more behavioral problems, had more negative attitudes generally, and towards school and family in particular, were highly fearful, and suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, showed more sexualized behavior, and exhibited a stance of hypervigilance towards the world. The majority of the effects listed were more severe in the group of children reporting RSA than in the group of children sexually abused without ritualistic or terrorizing elements. The treatment of children involved in ritualistic sexual abuse must focus on concomitants of powerlessness and specifically on anxiety and fear. Some of the most pervasive effects in this study on children's functioning involved fearfulness, flashbacks, hypervigilance, and other symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. These symptoms were also among the most likely to persist at follow-up 5 years later and must be addressed in the treatment of children reporting RSA. The study noted that non-abusive parents in RSA cases were similarly more severely affected, with divorce rates higher than in the, quote, ordinary sexual abuse group, that the process of disclosing took much longer for the RSA group than the SA group, but that the child victims of ritual abuse can heal given therapy. Only 17% exhibited the same worrying level of emotional or behavioral problems 5 years after their original disclosure. That 83% of the children in the RSA group had been, to whatever degree, given successful counselling is a tribute to the therapists concerned. According to Pam Hudson, most work in conditions of isolation from their professional colleagues, and in particular without support from the law enforcement process. Quote, "We're really on our own in this," it's the therapist. "People just don't want to know about it. When you tell them, and when they see you believe in the existence of satanic ritual abuse, you're attacked and attempts are made to discredit you. There are three major charges leveled. The first is that we just want fame and fortune. We're just making ourselves famous by doing ritual abuse cases in the hope that it's going to bring us money. Alternatively, we're accused of having a pathological preoccupation with the idea of ritual abuse. The third accusation is that we're all fundamentalist Christians and therefore we're seeing the devil everywhere." Speaking for myself, this is the therapist speaking, I'm not a fundamentalist, though I am Presbyterian. And if you know anything about Presbyterians, you'll know that they're very dry Christians. If we have a problem, we simply appoint a committee rather than consulting the Bible. It's wonderfully middle class and middle of the road. I don't in any way accept that the Bible is always accurate or has a monopoly on wisdom. As to the rest of the charges, let me make it clear. When I get a case that winds up being about ritual abuse, I get very depressed. They take up much too much time and energy compared to the numbers involved. You don't get fame and fortune doing ritual cases. If anything, you get grief and poverty when you get involved in this stuff. Grief, poverty, and danger. Some therapists, not all of them Christian and none of them fundamentalists, fearful for their souls, have reported attempts to terrorize them when they've become involved with counseling satanic abuse survivors. According to Pam Klein, a highly respected Chicago-based child sexual abuse therapist, quote, "Some of my colleagues have been issued with personal weapons by local police forces. I am personally involved with one therapist who, after she began working with a child victim, received a human arm in the post. This is not anecdotal. I know it to be true. Will I put you in touch with the therapist? No, I will not. She's in enough danger as it is." Nor is the danger confined to the occasional activities of those who wish to dissuade investigation. Pamela Hudson has now ceased to work with adult survivors of satanic ritual abuse because of the threat of violence from them. Quote, "My private practice is in my home, and I won't now invite any adult survivors into my home. They are destructive, dangerous people. One moment they might be compliant, but the next, in a different alter, multiple personality disorder persona, and they're threatening to burn down the house. I saw one such patient who I saw at the public clinic. She developed such anger towards me, she grew paranoid about me. And when I went on a vacation, she decided that I wasn't answering her phone calls. She began making threatening phone calls, and the next thing I knew she was going to burn me out. In the end, I had to get a restraining order against her. I knew I had to draw the line, and I won't do adult cases anymore." The success of Hudson Klein and other therapists prepared to face up to children's stories of satanic abuse has been achieved despite the resistance and opposition of the law enforcement community and in the face of a vociferous campaign to isolate and discredit them. Early in 1989, Hudson tried to warn her counterparts in Britain about the backlash they would inevitably face. Quote, "It's happened to all of us who work this field. The idea is to shoot the messenger rather than hearing the bad news she or he is bringing. It's a way to discredit those of us who are prepared to acknowledge the problem. You will get discredited too. It's a baptism by fire, and I think you should just sort of expect it. It goes with the territory." Her prediction was fulfilled to the letter. Not only were individual social workers vilified, but the oldest and best respected child welfare charity in the country was subjected to a sustained level of criticism unknown in the consensus-dominated politics of child welfare since the abolition of child labour. You see, the thing I need to say is these groups get infiltrated by Satanists and ritual abusers. Organisations and charities may have started out to help, but because of their influence, of course they're infiltrated. Of course they are. By 1989, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, the NSPCC, had been concerned about children's satanic abuse disclosures for several years. It had quietly instructed several of its area offices with established ritual cases to examine the details and draw up an internal briefing document. On the 17th of July that year, prompted by the Cook Report programme detailing evidence of a number of such cases, the NSPCC issued its first public statement on the problem. Quote, "The NSPCC is becoming increasingly anxious about the existence of ritualistic abuse involving children in this country. Tonight's Cook Report and developing concern within the professional network are adding to this. It seems clear that children are being sexually abused, coerced, threatened, frightened, and physically assaulted in ritualistic ceremonies. A major fear must now be that children have been killed or that lives of others are seriously at risk. The initial response to allegations of ritual abuse is often disbelief, followed by denial and ridicule, because the children's accounts of events often seem unbelievable. The NSPCC is very concerned that children must be listened to and that professionals and parents should not simply discount children's testimony as fantasy." Within hours, the NSPCC was hit by backlash from police officers, skeptical therapists, and the national press. Many treated the entire subject as a bad joke, a spoof which the society had been gullible enough to believe. A week later, Dr. Alan Gilmore, then director of the NSPCC, responded, quote, "I don't think there's any made-up bad joke about it at all. We have more and more circumstances where there seems to be a ritualistic element in child abuse cases, and we need to take it very seriously. We had something like this when we first discovered sexual abuse. People wouldn't believe the children at all and sent them back off to the perpetrator to be punished for lying. I think the same applies here. We need to make this public. We need to get across a public awareness and understanding that these things can and do happen, because it's only when you get across that background that children's stories are listened to. But we also need to all work together. Doctors, social workers, the police, the probation service, teachers, and the NSPCC. All the professionals working with children need to share and cooperate. Otherwise, we won't get to the bottom of this." There is a bitter irony in that last remark. The, quote, "evidence brought forward to, quote, disprove the existence of organised satanic ritual abuse and thereby discredit the NSPCC consisted of two celebrated cases. In both, the issue of ritual abuse had been raised and then very publicly dropped. Yet both in the McMartin preschool and in Nottingham, the reason for this collapse was not lack of evidence, but the lack of precisely that unified and cooperative approach for which Alan Gilmore had pleaded. And that is, I believe, the end of chapter 6. So the next recording will be chapter 7, Hear No Evil. Thanks for your patience, people. Angela Power Disney, there is a link in the description box if you would like to contribute towards my work or that of the person that transcribed the manuscripts. My blog is angelascaches.org. I'm usually active daily as well on Facebook, Angela Power Disney, and YouTube. Thanks for your interest. Please, if you are in any of the bodies referred to, police, social work, therapy, or survivors or parents of survivors, please share this book. I'll put it on all of the chapters are in a playlist, with the exception of the first chapter. I hadn't made a playlist at that point, but all of them are on my YouTube channel in a playlist, YouTube channel, and the first 5 chapters are on my blog, and I'll put the final 5 when I finish them. So that's the end of chapter 6, with apologies for some interruptions. As I say, we're in the middle of a fake virus lockdown, so I feel an urgency to put this stuff on the record, you know, and pray that it makes a difference. God bless.